do not fit into the general concept that we have of the state of the world when the pyramid was presumed to have been built. The only possible answer is, on this level, that at the time the pyramid builders labored, they had a knowledge among themselves that had not been distributed to the people. Even the rulers did not possess this knowledge. And that there was a cult or sect of architects and artificers, the builders of monuments, who knew the proportions and mathematics and had deeply imbibed from the wisdom of Pythagoras and Euclid. But even this isn't a complete explanation, for it is almost impossible to determine how this tremendous job was done. The idea that we have is far too trite. They thought that perhaps they were simply built as a result of slave labor in Egypt will not hold water. It is simply not sufficient. The amount of work that is involved in those monuments simply transcends imagination. Also, they require a skill and a group of instrumental aids, which we do not believe that antiquity possessed. So a great many persons long ago in Alexandria, and more recently right here now, have fallen back upon this supernatural hypothesis. When we can't imagine how a thing was done, we begin to believe that it must have been done by magic or some supernatural power or force. The Chinese have long believed that their Great Wall was built by the gods. They did not believe that any human being could build it. And it is only natural when we come into the presence of something that transcends our own abilities that we begin to wonder whether some strange esoteric means was involved, as in the case of the statues on Easter Island and many other such unsolved mysteries of antiquity. To fall back upon this supernatural theory is comforting to a degree, but it can lead us into serious complications, because we know that the Egyptians and other nations of that period were esotericists. We know that they had a knowledge of natural law far ahead of their time, and they had a responsibility for the use of natural law far ahead of our time. These people had a deep appreciation for the immensity and integrity of the universal plan. They had already discovered thousands of years ago that you cannot break natural law without suffering. They had never developed that strange type of egotism which impels us often to assume that God is depending upon us to take care of his purposes and plans. They did not think this. They realized or believed that they were the servants of an infinite reality. Now, in the development of Neo-Alexandrian mysticism, we have an interesting point that is brought out by Plotinus and Proclus, namely that mysticism, which is an internalization of faculties and which releases certain esoteric forces within the person, very often, in fact almost always, also gives rise to a less fortunate situation, and that is psychic phenomena. The mystic is more inclined than anyone else to believe in the psychic factors of life. And because these are inconstant, and because most of them arise within the imagination of individuals, psychism leads to difficulties, even while mysticism leads to spiritual attainment. They are not the same thing. The pyramid, as it stands today, there is, of course, the largest and most important of several groups of such similar buildings scattered around through Egypt and other parts of North Africa. For all intent and purposes, we are told that in the year 820 A.D., the Caliph al-Ma'mun of Baghdad brought a large number of workmen to Egypt to explore the Great Pyramid. The reason he did this was because there was a legend to the effect that the pyramid had been built by mysterious giants called the Shaddai. that they had buried within the pyramid a great treasure and had guarded it with demons and monsters and all kinds of supernatural forces. Al-Mamun wanted to study this for himself, and he also was very anxious to get hold of that treasure, which was presumably somewhere within the pyramid. In order to gain his end, this son of the faithful brought with him workmen from Baghdad. These workmen were good Muslims and were also honest and faithful servants of the Caliph. But likewise, they had been induced to hope that were the treasure found, they would benefit also. In fact, they had been assured that such would be the case. And one day, in the early 9th century, the Caliph Al-Mamun stood at the face and base of the Great Pyramid. It was one shining surface. All of the capping stones were in place. There was no mark or opening anywhere on any of the four sides. It was so perfectly covered that it reflected the sun like a mirror on all of the sides of the southeast and west, glistened and gleamed with the light of the sun, and only the north side was silent and dark. Mamun was completely overwhelmed by this structure, over 400 feet in height. A shining pyramid-shaped body rising from a square base with four equilateral triangular sides. He just stood and looked at it. But the important thing for us, I think, to remember is that at that time all of the surfacing stones were in place. The pyramid did not consist of a series of steps of blocks. Everything was smooth. Each level had been cased and surfaced with properly cut stones, so perfectly trued that it was not possible to insert a knife blade in the space between them. It is also believed that much of this work was done without any cement, because the fittings of the stones were so perfect. Sometime between about the 9th century and now, all these casing stones have disappeared except 6. There are 6 stones left to remind us of what was originally the entire facing of the building. These stones are huge, weigh hundreds, maybe thousands of pounds, and they are still in place, but that's all there is of them. All the rest have gone. Now, we are told that they probably were used to build various structures in the city of Cairo, that they were used to create palaces and mosques for the Muslims, and that little by little the Great Pyramid was turned into a quarry to be the source of base materials for building purposes. This answers one question, however, that we have to consider. There are some marks on the sides of the pyramid, considerable distance from the ground, which have been believed to mark water erosion, and the idea that the pyramid was at some time or other submerged, up at least 2/3 of the way. If Mamun's statements can be believed, this is not possible. Also, it is more likely that these markings, these marks that look like water erosions, are actually sand erosions that were the result of sand blowing against the walls after the capping stones and facing stones had been removed. So the probabilities of the so-called antediluvian date remains speculative. We do not know. One thing is probably inevitable, that whoever built the pyramid had a very great knowledge and presumably was wiser than most of the peoples in the world today. We know, when I was in Egypt, I talked to a French architect who was standing alongside me at the foot of the Great Pyramid. And he said, if this building had not survived, if the modern world had had nothing in the form